Welcome to In Focus. I'm your host, Thuy Phan. We will never forget what we were doing when we heard about the attacks on the Twin Towers on 9/11. This year marks 10 years since America changed the way they dealt with terrorists, and has been 10 long years for one Orange County father who has lived without his daughter because of these attacks. Join me as we find out what this day means for him.
Oh, I'm so proud of her. I'm so very, very proud of her. She lived her life like every day was her last. Shouldn't we all?
Every year when September 11th rolls around, Tom Frost relives a certain kind of sorrow and heartache that only a father who lost his daughter in the terrorist attacks could ever understand.
September 11th, 2001, I was at my job with Southern California Edison. I was on shift on a desk job. I work a rotating shift, so I was on the graveyard. I didn't get off till 7 o'clock in the morning. It was about 4:15 a.m. West Coast time. My phone rang at my desk. It was Lisa. She was at Logan Airport. She was at a payphone at Gate 19. Lisa never owned a cell phone. Isn't that unusual? It was just coming into being. She said, "We got across the Big Dig," which is a construction project in Boston. Pretty hard to get across. We made it to the airport on time. She was in a hurry. She said, "I'll see you at LAX in a few hours." I said, "I'm just going to go home, catch a couple hours sleep, and I'll drive up and get you. Love you. Love you too." It was 15 minutes later, Lisa boarded United 175. It was a little bit before 6 o'clock that morning when one of my crews called from the field, Scott, and told me that, "Tom, turn on the TV, there's something happening in New York City." And I turned it on to see the North Tower on fire, with smoke coming out of it. Flight 11 had already hit it. They were having being photographed from a helicopter looking west. Suddenly I saw another jumbo jet come out of the left side of the TV screen and slam into the tower, and thought, this can't be happening. What is that? Is this some kind of TV movie or something? We then realized that this was for real. Something was going on. About that time, they mentioned that the plane was a non-stop from Logan to LAX, and my heart stopped. It was about 8:30 West Coast time when I got a call from the young man that took Lisa to the airport. And he was the one who first told me. They've just reported on the Boston stations Lisa's plane was hijacked and crashed. They don't know where. I went down to Toastmasters International where Melanie worked and picked her up, brought her home. We contacted United, and it was about 1:30 that afternoon when United called and said, okay, it was the second plane to enter the World Trade Tower, so at least we knew. And we knew that she was on the passenger manifest. After that, it just seems like a whirlwind. I got a call, one of the first calls I got, and I'll never forget it. The secretary said, "Please hold for John Bryson." John Bryson was the chairman and CEO of Edison International. You don't get any higher. And he says, "Tom, I've got 2 younger daughters that are about that age, and I can't imagine what you're going through." Tough day.
That tough day was only the beginning of the long journey that Frost has since had to endure. As painful as it was to come to grips with the fact that his daughter had perished in the attacks, was the realization that he watched it, unknowingly witnessing the death of his child.
When that young man called from Boston, that's when I realized the sad truth that I just watched my daughter be murdered live, and watched it. And that's a memory I'm going to have to take to my grave. And that's a tough one to live with. It's a very tough nut to live with. It's something that doesn't give me nightmares at night, but it always seeps into the back of my head. And when I see images of the plane moments from hitting the building on documentaries or TV programs or news, whatever, it hits home again. That's when it hits home again. It just keeps hitting home and hitting home every time I see that. It's an image that is frozen in time. It's on all the front pages. It's the defining image of 9/11, I think. From that plane hitting into that building and grazing, part of Lisa's right hip went down and came to rest on top of a Borders bookstore. They found that. They've found 4 DNA matches for her. They found part of her collarbone, part of her right hip, a small bone fragment from her right femur, and a skin tissue sample. Those have been cremated and brought back and laid to rest in a cemetery over here in Orange.
Although what they were able to recover wasn't much, it's more than what many other victims' families have gotten, and it has brought a measure of peace to him and his family.
One of Lisa's co-workers in Boston, before she left, told her, "Lisa, you're doing such a great job here in Boston. Why don't you just stay?" And Lisa said, "I'm from California and I want to go home." And we brought her home. She got home. That was monumental. I know Lisa's story is very hard to talk about. It's very hard to relive almost every day. And for the last 10 years, I can't believe it's been 10 years that I've been living this. There are days when I'm strong. There are days when I cry. The tears are almost a relief, a release, if you will, that it helps break the tension. I think about her every day. It's always there, but there are times when you have to try and kind of shut it off. And people say, "Okay, it's done, move on." Well, you know, I'd like to, but it doesn't go away. It's in the news. There's a reference to it, or they shoot bin Laden, or something always seems to be happening. And being as close to it as I am, I've had a lot of personal experiences that the normal public has not. I've been privy to a lot of ceremonies and events that give me information that is not public knowledge necessarily. Like meeting the parents of passengers on Lisa's plane, that their son, daughter-in-law, and 2-year-old grandchild were on the flight with Lisa, and he called her from the plane, telling her they've murdered the stewardess, they've hijacked the plane, called the FBI. She said, "Get off the phone or they're going to kill you too." And you have to remember, it was almost 50 minutes into their flight before the hijackers took the plane over. It wasn't right off the bat. And then it was only 16 minutes from the time they took it over until the time they crashed it into the South Tower. 16 minutes can be the blink of an eye. Now, Eunice was telling me that she was watching the TV as well as I was that morning. And when the plane slammed into the building, and she had got a call from her son again, just minutes before the plane crashed, saying, he told her, "I think they're going to crash the plane." And he stopped talking. And she was told by a flight engineer that at that altitude, at some 630 miles an hour, which the plane was going, you're pulling about 5 Gs, and most people pass out at 2.5 to 3. So hopefully he and Lisa and the others on that plane were passed out. I believe that's part of the reason why that plane grazed the building. It hit the corner. It didn't hit directly into it like Flight 11 did. I think the pilot was even starting to go out. But she was watching the TV, and as soon as the plane hit the building, the other end of the phone line went to static. Now, I have my memory of watching Lisa die, but I can't even imagine that one. That's tough, tough.
These stories that he shares are personal accounts between other grieving family members that he's met throughout the years. He says he still remembers one of the questions he was asked immediately following Lisa's death.
I remember one of the questions the reporter asked me. He says, "If you could tell President Bush anything right now, what would you say?" And I say, "All I want is justice. I don't want revenge. Do not go after someone just because they wear a turban or because they're Islamic. They're not, I'm sure, anywhere involved in this. There are extremists out there, and just because they may be a part of that religion doesn't mean that they're the same thing as people that are doing this." And luckily and thankfully, 10 years later, I can actually say we got justice. Bin Laden's been caught and taken care of, and he's been brought to justice. That's all I ever wanted. It's a funny thing, people ask me about Lisa, and she's my favorite subject to talk about. But at the same time, it's painful. And it does hurt. But I get great joy knowing that she's an inspiration to people, that her name will be inscribed along that railing on those trade tower footprints at Ground Zero, that there will be somewhere in the Memorial Museum that her story will be told. And I hope that there will be 3,000 other stories that'll inspire at least one person to go out and do a kind act. Lisa was very much into community service. And I think that's one of the ways that we can, as Americans, just the Joe common American, tell whoever our enemies are that whatever you thought you might be doing to break us down, you just made us stronger and bonded us as a nation. Don't be prejudiced against anyone just because they might look like a terrorist. The young lady whom I talked to that was at the airport and her mother was on the flight with Lisa told me once that she watched Lisa and her mother get on the plane. She was the last person to actually see Lisa alive that I talked to that would maybe remember it. She also told me that about a month later she was watching the TV and they had terrorists on there, and she screamed and her husband came in the room. He says, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" She says, "I saw that guy. He was getting up to get on the plane when Mom and Lisa were in line. He had a Hawaiian print shirt on. You would have never known that he was a terrorist."
And although Lisa is long gone, Frost says he knows she is still with him and has a hand in certain miracles that have taken place.
One of the best ones was that I did a radio interview, and I believe it was the 3rd anniversary, and a young man found out about, he heard it, started a service project in Lisa's memory called the Beanie Brigade, where they gathered used Beanie Babies and sent them to the troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, who would then give them to the children over there as a peace offering. Got a letter home from one of the troopers. I would send Lisa buttons with them. The trooper had Lisa's button on his uniform in the picture of him. He told us that a few days after they gave the beanies out, there was a little girl sitting in the road that stopped a troop transport, clutching that Beanie Baby, telling them there's a landmine in the road about a mile ahead. They made a friend with that Beanie Baby, and no one got hurt. And it makes me feel very good that I did that interview and that maybe a chain reaction was set into place that made it so that there's other parents that aren't grieving like I am.
Coming up after the break, find out what keeps Tom Frost going and why Lisa's memory will never be forgotten. You definitely don't want to miss it. Stay with us.